The small village nestled quietly at the foot of the hill was wrapped in a deep and uneasy silence. The weather forecast had warned that heavy rain was coming that night. Jack had just returned home after a long and exhausting day working on the farm. His small wooden house stood at the very end of the village, near the stream and the old forest. That evening, the sky suddenly changed color. Dark clouds rolled in quickly, swallowing the moonlight. Lightning tore across the sky, followed by loud thunder that shook the entire village. One by one, the villagers hurried to shut their doors and windows. No one dared to step outside. Then suddenly, from the eastern field, a terrified scream pierced through the wind. "Help me!" Jack froze. His heart pounded violently in his chest. He recognized that voice immediately. It was Ly Tu Tien. Without wasting another second, he grabbed his oil lamp and rushed into the storm. The rain began to pour heavily, each drop striking the ground like stones. The wind whipped fiercely against Jack's face, making it nearly impossible for him to keep his eyes open. The field that looked so peaceful during the day had now turned into a frightening place under the constant flashes of lightning. Jack followed the desperate cries. Through the sheets of rain, he finally saw her. Ly Tu Tien was trapped in the rushing floodwater near the large irrigation ditch. The bamboo bridge crossing the ditch had already collapsed from the previous storm. One of her legs was caught beneath a fallen branch. "Jack! Save me!" Her voice trembled with fear. Jack jumped straight into the freezing water. The current was much stronger than he had expected. Wave after wave slammed into his legs, nearly knocking him over. He held tightly onto the bamboo poles by the bank and forced himself forward, step by step, toward Tu Tien. The rain grew heavier. Thunder roared above them. Tu Tien was almost out of strength, and the water had already risen to her chest. Jack shouted at the top of his lungs. "Hold on to me." He stretched out his hand, but the distance was still too far. Suddenly, a large log came rushing straight toward her. Without thinking, Jack threw himself in front of it. The impact was brutal. He was thrown violently into the water. The current swept Jack several meters away. But he refused to give up. He fought his way back through the raging water. Tu Tien was crying uncontrollably, watching him in terror. Jack swam against the current, his hands bleeding after hitting sharp rocks beneath the muddy water. Finally, he reached her. Their hands locked together. "Don't let go." Both of them clung desperately to the roots of a large tree by the bank. Then the earth beneath them began to collapse. Mud and stones slid down with a deafening roar. 1 second later, and they would both be swept away. Jack looked around in desperation. Ahead of them, on slightly higher ground, stood an abandoned hay shed. It was the only safe place in sight. Without hesitation, Jack lifted Tu Tien onto his back. He struggled through the fierce water, every single step feeling like a battle against nature itself. Rain, wind, mud, thunder. Everything around them seemed determined to drag them under. But Jack kept moving forward. At last, they made it inside the hay shed. It was dark, but at least it was dry. Tu Tien was trembling from the cold. Jack quickly gathered some dry hay and old wood to start a small fire. The warm glow of the flames lit up their exhausted faces. Tu Tien looked at him with grateful eyes. "If you hadn't come, I would have." Jack gave her a gentle smile. "I would never let anything happen to you." As the rain continued to fall outside, Tu Tien finally explained why she had gone out. She had gone to search for a lost calf in the field. She never expected the flood to rise so quickly. Jack fell silent. He knew that if he had arrived even a little later, the outcome would have been unimaginable. Their eyes met in the firelight. In that quiet moment, something deeper began to grow between them. A feeling neither of them could ignore. Outside, the wind became even more violent. The roof of the shed started shaking. A large tree crashed down right beside it. Jack knew they could no longer stay. The shelter was no longer safe. He made a quick decision. They had to return to the village immediately, even in the middle of the storm. Jack helped Tu Tien walk along the muddy road. The rainwater had risen to their knees. Far in the distance, the faint lights of the village flickered through the darkness. But the road felt endless. Every step was exhausting. Every gust of wind threatened to knock them down. Still, Jack refused to stop. As they were getting close to the village, a large branch suddenly snapped from above. Jack reacted instantly. He shoved Tu Tien out of the way. The branch slammed hard into his shoulder. He fell to the ground. Tu Tien screamed in panic. Jack! Despite the intense pain, Jack forced himself back to his feet. Blood slowly soaked through his shirt from his injured shoulder. But he kept walking. He gritted his teeth and continued leading her back to safety. Tu Tien burst into tears. She had never seen someone risk so much for her. At last, they reached the village. The villagers rushed out to help them. The rain slowly began to fade. In the east, the sky started to brighten. A new dawn appeared. Just as Jack collapsed in front of his house, the first light of morning touched the horizon. After a night of terror, the first sunrise finally arrived. Tu Tien knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. Please don't fall asleep, please. The next morning, Tu Tien carefully tended to Jack's wounds. Her voice trembled as she said, "You saved my life." Jack looked at her softly. "As long as you're safe, nothing else matters." After that fateful night, Tu Tien finally understood her true feelings. She held Jack's hand tightly. "I don't want to lose you." Jack gently squeezed her hand in return. That stormy night was not only a night of survival. It was the beginning of a beautiful love story in the peaceful countryside. From that day on, Jack and Ly Tu Tien stayed by each other's side, building a happy life together. That night, the village was finally quiet. The storm that had raged so fiercely only hours before had completely passed, leaving behind a strange and beautiful stillness. Outside the window, the moon slowly emerged from behind the fading clouds, casting a soft silver glow over the wet fields and rooftops. Jack and Tu Tien remained seated beside the window, neither of them willing to break the fragile warmth of the moment. For a while, they simply listened to the sound of water dripping from the roof and the distant murmur of the stream, now calmer after the flood. Tu Tien looked out across the dark countryside and spoke softly. "I was so scared." Jack turned toward her. "Scared of the storm?" She slowly shook her head. "No, scared that I would never see you again." Her words hung gently in the air. Jack's heart tightened. For so long, he had hidden his feelings behind quiet kindness and silent protection. But after everything that had happened that night, there was no longer any reason to hide the truth. He looked at her with eyes full of tenderness. "When I heard your voice in the storm, I didn't think about the danger." He paused, his voice low and sincere. "I only knew that I had to find you." Tu Tien's eyes began to glisten once more. The fire beside them crackled softly, filling the room with a warm orange glow. Jack slowly reached out and brushed a strand of wet hair away from her face. I was terrified too, he admitted. Not of the flood, not of the storm. He looked directly into her eyes. I was afraid of losing you. At that moment, tears slipped quietly down Tu Tien's cheeks. A gentle smile appeared on her lips. Then, without another word, she leaned closer and rested her head softly against his shoulder. The pain from his wound was still there, but somehow it no longer mattered. Jack wrapped his arm around her carefully. Outside, the first stars began to appear in the clearing sky. The world that had felt so dangerous only hours ago was now peaceful again. After a long silence, Tu Tien whispered, "Do you think this was fate?" Jack smiled softly. "Maybe." He looked out at the moonlit fields. "Or maybe the storm was only meant to bring us together." Tu Tien lifted her head and looked at him, her eyes filled with warmth and quiet happiness. "Then I'm grateful for that storm." Jack laughed softly. "So am I." The room fell silent once again, but this time the silence was full of comfort, love, and promise. Neither of them knew what the future would bring. There would still be hard days on the farm. There would still be storms, rain, and uncertainty. But now, they would face everything together. As dawn slowly began to paint the horizon with soft shades of gold and pink, Jack gently took her hand once more. "From now on," he said quietly, "you'll never have to face anything alone." Tu Tien held his hand tightly. "And neither will you." In that peaceful countryside morning, after the longest night of their lives, two hearts that had once been separated by fear were finally joined by love. The storm had taken many things, but it had also given them something priceless: each other. And from that day forward, every sunrise over the village would remind them of the night that changed their lives forever. That evening, after Jack had rested, the sky was finally clear. The storm clouds had disappeared, leaving behind a peaceful sunset over the countryside. Tu Tien sat beside him near the open window, watching the orange light fade across the fields. For a long moment, she remained silent. Then she finally spoke softly. "Jack, last night, when I thought I was going to lose you." Her voice trembled. "I realized something." Jack turned to look at her. Tu Tien lowered her eyes, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her sleeve. "I was more afraid of losing you than losing my own life." The room fell silent. Jack's expression softened. He had felt the same thing in his heart but never dared to say it. Tu Tien slowly looked up, her eyes glistening. "You risked everything for me." Jack gave a faint smile. "I would do it again." Tears welled in her eyes. "No one has ever cared for me like that." Jack gently reached for her hand. His voice was low and sincere. "Because you mean more to me than you know." At that moment, both of them understood what had been growing between them since the storm began. It was no longer fear. It was love.